The Nikon Z7, Nikon's $3,400 45 megapixel full frame mirrorless camera. It's historic. It is their first full frame mirrorless camera. If you want to pick one of these up, you can use these links here. This also shows you the price differences. And hey, if you want to actually just win an X-T3 or a Canon EOS R or the new iPhone, go to freesdp.com. Full disclosure, we have attended press events for every single one of these cameras. We do not allow that to change our review one way or another. And I also say this is boring and dry, and some people see us do these sort of technical tests and they suppose that we think that's what's important in photography. No, we do this because we want to know how each of these cameras will perform in different extreme conditions, so that when we're faced with a photography task, we know which camera to pick up, so that you as a camera buyer know which one suits your style of photography best, so that you can then get the camera and not have to worry about these technical things. If you actually want to learn the stuff that's important to photography, check out our book, Stunning Digital Photography, which has more than 14 hours of video. It's been the #1 photography book in the world for like 5 years now. You can get it at Amazon, check the reviews there, or just go to northrop.photo and there's a 20% off coupon, GAS, like gear acquisition syndrome. We also have books on Photoshop and Lightroom and our Art and Science of Photography video training series, which will go to the next level, go deeper than we can on YouTube. You can also buy cool t-shirts like the one I'm wearing here. First up, the Nikon Z7 versus the D850. This is a question a lot of you are asking if you're shooting Nikon's existing mirrorless system. Nikon told us over and over again that the Z7 was a mirrorless D850, that it focused like a D850. And if anything, the image quality would be a little bit better because the sensor is new. It is not a mirrorless D850. It has some advantages and disadvantages. Quickly, the advantages of the D850: more buttons. It has lighted buttons. It has a separate shutter dial where you change the modes. It has 2 AF on buttons, so you can easily switch between single focus points and all focus points. It has 2 memory cards, so you have an instant backup. It is a very simple focusing system where you can hit that AF on button and it will focus. I have never taken it out of AFC and single auto point focusing mode because that works for any scenario. Still subjects, night photography, whatever, it works. It has a better face metering. In other words, it will find faces in the image and automatically meter off of them. That's something that the Z7 will only do in one of its focusing modes. And it has great 3D tracking as subjects move side to side. That's something that doesn't work great on the Z7. The Z7 Pros, on the other hand, it is smaller and lighter. It supports the new Nikon S lenses. There's not really any of those right now, just a couple available. It has sensor stabilization. That's one I'll show you the importance of in just a second. It has an electronic viewfinder that allows you to see the actual exposure, allows you to use depth of field previews without the viewfinder getting darker, and allows you to see focus peaking and a histogram in the viewfinder. Incredibly useful. It makes a big difference in your photography. It can do silent shooting using the viewfinder, which the D850 can't do, and it has a very nice top LCD. Let's look at the image quality. First up, as you look at these pictures, you're going to see a pretty drastic difference. Obviously, the Z7 on the left here looks drastically better than the Nikon D850. And if you look at my settings up here, you'll see the settings are different. The reason they're different is this is my handheld test. I handheld in a dark room and got the best image that I could take using the rule of doubles. You can search YouTube and you'll find my video on that. And this is what came up. The Nikon D850 does not have a stabilized sensor. The Nikon Z7 does. I was using the 105mm f1.4 unstabilized lens, and anything that I shot at 1/3 of a second on the D850 was blurry. But the Nikon Z7, yeah, I was able to handhold a 105mm lens down to 1/3 of a second. This will work with any Nikon lens. So if you have a great Nikon lens collection, and a lot of them don't have stabilization, like a lot of the best lenses don't, those are suddenly stabilized. And if you're shooting handheld, this doesn't make a 1/10 of a stop difference or a 1 stop difference. It can make a 5 stop difference in your images. It is dramatic. And that alone is going to be a reason for a lot of people to upgrade. The rest of the images that you'll see are taken on a tripod under very careful conditions. And some of you actually shoot like that, but I know most of you shoot a little more realistically, a little more real world where you're just hand holding things. First, let's talk about dynamic range. This is a Z7 image. If I raise the exposure here 5 stops and we peek in the corner here, so we're talking about a black subject in deep shadows, we can see banding. This is caused by the phase detect autofocus system. Phase detect sensors are built into the sensor in little rows like that. You will not see that on the D850. This is kind of a big deal to some people. I know you're saying, oh, if you have to raise your exposure by 5 stops, you're not a real photographer, but that's not an understanding of what actually happens in high contrast situations. If you're a landscape photographer and you're shooting into the sun, it is very common to need to raise the exposure by 5 stops in at least part of the scene in order to balance the bright sun versus landscape that might be in shadow. As a wildlife photographer, it's very common to need to recover 5 stops of shadow because birds are often in complete shadow and the bright sky can be right behind them. So this might have an impact on your photography, but actually I don't think it's that bad. I think it's overblown. I'll say, having taken a lot of lab and real world shots with the D850, for some reason in the lab tests, the Z7 shots are always a little bit less sharp. If you check out the DP Review's own studio shots, the Z7 shots are less sharp, and I can't exactly explain that. This happened to us consistently too, and we talked to Nikon about it, and I talked to Rishi at DP Review about it. It just seems to be a little bit less sharp, and we can't do anything about it. But in the real world, when I went out and actually shot with it, sometimes the Z7 would be less sharp, sometimes the D850 would be a little bit less sharp. So I'm going to say that the difference in image quality between these two cameras in decent light conditions isn't enough for anybody to worry about. The banding, like I said, I wouldn't worry about that. Some people will, but I don't think that you should. Jumping up to ISO 6400, at this point the Nikon Z7 actually looks a little bit better. I think it's a little bit cleaner than the D850, though they're very, very close, and I don't think most people are going to notice a difference. But look at the noise on the wall here versus the noise on the wall here. To me, the Z7 is a little bit smoother. If you're doing your own comparisons, I'll warn you that Nikon built lens profiles and Lightroom defaults into the Z7 images that are not in the D50 images. So getting them to match up is a little bit of a challenge. We've taken care to do that, but other people could very easily overlook it. Zooming in at ISO 40,000 here, the D850 actually looks a little bit better to me. I start to see some remnants of that banding that we saw. Let's see how the Nikon Z7 compares to the 42 megapixel Sony A7R III, its closest mirrorless competitor. The A7R III has a lot of advantage. It has 2 memory card slots, so you have an instant backup. It has excellent usable eye autofocus. Only Sony really has that. It has a very simple focusing system like the D850. You can punch AF on and it will focus under any conditions with no fooling with different settings or going into different modes. It has a higher FPS. It has more native lenses. New, it's $400 cheaper. Used, it's $1,000 cheaper because you can't buy the Z7 used right now. It has pixel shift, which I'll show you in just a second, and the Wi-Fi system is vastly superior to Nikon's. The Z7 has a couple of pros, the biggest of which is the Z7 can be adapted to any Nikon lens essentially, and autofocus works really well. Technically, you can get Nikon adapters for the Sony, but they work awfully. And yes, we've tested them. We didn't even want to review them. They worked so bad that we cannot recommend you try to put Nikon lenses on your Sony cameras. In other words, if you want to use your Nikon lenses on a mirrorless camera, you get the Z7. I cannot recommend anybody try to do that with your Sony. If you want to use a Sony, sell your lenses and get Sony lenses. The Z7 might be better weather sealed. I know the Sonys aren't the best at weather sealing, but I don't have a good way to test that. And the Z7 has an XQD card, which is much faster. Buffering is a problem on the Sony because you can't say access the menus or switch to video when things are buffering, and the cards are a little bit slow, so that's kind of a common problem. Let's compare the dynamic range at the base ISO, ISO 64 for the Z7 or ISO 100 for the A7R III. Not talking about extended ISOs, but native ISOs. On the Z7, you see that banding, but on the A7R III, you actually see a lot of crazy noise and color, sort of blotchy greens and magentas. And to my eye, I prefer the look of the Z7 banding or not. You can see that blotching is kind of prominent throughout the whole frame in deeply recovered shadows. Let's compare high ISO image quality at ISO 40,000. To me, the A7R III looks quite a bit better. The noise is a little bit less, and it seems to have a little bit better detail. So with a single image, the Z7 wins for base ISO dynamic range, and the A7R III wins for high ISO, but the differences are really slight, and it's not going to make as much of a difference as, say, your choice of lenses. Now let's talk about pixel shift. With pixel shift, the Sony takes 4 consecutive frames, moving the sensor exactly 1 pixel between each frame. It then stacks those frames in software. I use Sony Pixel Shift to DNG, a currently free tool that does that automatically. It kind of drastically improves image quality. Let's take a look. Again, this is at the base ISO, giving the Nikon a bit of an advantage. But as we zoom in, we can see clearly that the Sony is much sharper and crisper, and that comes from stacking those 4 images. You can see just how much detail in the binding of this book appears. This is zoomed in 8:1, by the way. Look at these graphic images. They're so much clearer on the A7R3 now. Pixel shift makes a huge difference in detail, but it also dramatically improves noise and dynamic range. As we zoom into the same spot, you can see now the A7R3 looks crisper and cleaner with no banding. Pixel shift requires a tripod. It can handle some amount of movement in the frame if you're willing to go in and bring the separate images in as layers to manually eliminate that kind of movement. If you're an image perfectionist, pixel shift is an incredibly powerful tool. Visit this link for a free video on super resolution, which can help you replicate some of those effects in other cameras that don't have pixel shift. Now let's compare the Nikon Z7 to the Canon EOS R, Canon's new mirrorless camera. First, let me say this is kind of an unfair question because the EOS R is $1,100 cheaper. I wouldn't normally compare these two cameras, but they were both released about the same time, and a lot of people are curious about it. The EOS R uses SD cards, which are cheaper. The EOS R, to my eye, looks much nicer. It is generally better focusing than the Z7. It has some kind of IAF, though only sort of, and it has a flippy screen, so if you take selfies or you vlog, you might like that. The Z7 has many advantages. It has a proper thumbstick. It has a better AF on button that's in a better place. The power switch is under the index finger, so you don't have to use 2 hands to turn the camera on and off. It has sensor stabilization, which the EOS R lacks, and I showed you that earlier, but it's very, very important. The Z7 uses XQD cards that allow the buffer to clear faster, and the Z7 supports USB charging without a $200 adapter. Now let's look at the image quality comparing the Z7 to the EOS R. Zooming in 4:1, we can see they look actually pretty similar. Note that the images are a little bit different size because the Z7 is 45 megapixels while the EOS R is only 30 megapixels. But we don't really see a lot of that detail when using their standard kit lenses. On the Nikon, that's a 24-70 f4, and on the Canon, it's the 24-105 f4. I found that the Canon lens was significantly sharper than the Nikon lens, and that made up in many ways for the lower resolution. Raising the exposure of these images by 5 stops, let's peer into the shadows, and we can see here it's a big win for the Nikon. It's much cleaner. If we peer into the same dark corner again, we see lots of splotchy colors down here. The banding isn't yet appearing on the Canon in this image, but in bigger spaces you would see even worse banding than the Nikon has. At high ISO 6400, the Nikon looks a little bit better. It has less noise and is able to retain more detail. I hope you found this helpful. Please check the pinned comment for any additions or corrections that I might have. If you have questions or your own comments, please add a comment down below. If you want to pre-order one of these are our affiliate links and the relative prices. And of course, you can just win a free camera at freesdp.com. Yes, we've given away a camera before. It's for real. And if you want to get some cool stuff, a cool t-shirt like this, or actually learn photography, head to northrop.photo, our store. Use the 20% off coupon GAS, or just search for Tony Northrop on Amazon. Don't forget to subscribe to see our full reviews and give me a like, please. Thank you.